So your office, Doug sent me the average response times going back to 2018. And as you know, there's been a steady climb upwards in that time, a pretty significant jump from starting right around when COVID started. What do you see when you see these numbers?
I see increased demand, that the community has more needs with regards to emergency calls for service. We're seeing that reflected with the increases in crime. Violent crime and property crime are up not only in our city, but certainly across the entire state of Colorado. And unfortunately, we have fewer officers to meet the community's needs for emergency calls for service.
How big a problem is this?
Well, it's a significant problem. If you're in an emergency and you need the police, you want the police officers to arrive as quickly as possible. We need to let folks know and manage the expectations. When you have fewer police officers, that means that those response times go up. And that's not a good thing.
So right now, the average response time for priority, the top priority calls, 0. Do you have a priority 0?
It starts with priority 0. Okay. Zeros, ones, and twos, okay, the highest priority calls.
So from 0, 1 to 2, right now the average is 14 minutes and 28 seconds. Is that, in your view, just unavoidable and unacceptable?
Well, it's unacceptable when we're talking about unavoidable. This is supply and demand. There's too much demand with a 4.2% increase in calls for service last year and a depleting workforce, about 178 officers separated from the police department last year. So if you don't have enough officers to handle the 911 calls, there is an inherent delay as a result of that.
What would be, where would you like to see it, ideally?
Well, the city itself and many members of city council and the administration had worked very hard to get response times under 12 minutes. We had a stated goal of trying to get under 10 minutes. Unfortunately, with more than 14-minute call for service response time on high priority calls. These are shootings, these are stabbings, these are crimes of violence in progress. And we, as an emergency response team, need to get to those calls as quickly as possible. One, to stop the violence and render aid, but also to interrupt the crime and in many cases, or in some cases, try to hold the person accountable that's committing that crime.
So is the answer simply recruiting more cops?
Well, we are actively recruiting. We're looking for folks with big hearts that care about their community to join this police department, to be the change that they want to see, to help us keep the community safe. We're actively recruiting and hiring, and we're hopeful that in the future that we will get more candidates that are willing to do this very difficult but very important job.
And so other than getting more cops on the street, there's sort of nothing to do about this until demand comes down? And that also involves having more cops on the street?
Well, let's talk about demand for example. We have fewer officers today than we had 15 years ago. And I think that the census will tell you that a significant increase in population occurred over those last 15 years. Plenty of demands. Demands are not going down. I don't see decreases in emergency calls for service or any calls for service. Those appear to continue to go up. So we certainly need more resources in order to address that. One area that Denver has led the country is in alternative response. So on top of the STAR program that this department led the implementation of that program, we also have civilians that take low-level accident reports. We have civilian employees that do some of the low-level property reports so they can free up officers. We have redeployed injured officers to do low-level reports over the phone or on the computer to free up officers. So as far as maximizing the available resources, we certainly do that and have been national leaders in that space. That work continues, but right now the biggest challenge or the biggest issue that we're facing is that there's too many demands, too many emergency 911 calls, and not enough officers to respond as quickly as we would like.
The lower priority calls have also gone up, but not, if my basic math is correct, not as much by percentage-wise as the higher priority calls.
Well,
Is that my...
yeah, I mean, if we're doing a percentage breakdown, I think that's an accurate representation. But they've gone up.
They've gone up, yeah.
If it was 28 minutes and 52 seconds in 2018, and now 34:25,
That's still, yeah.
that's a much longer time period that folks. And again, this is the sum. This is the average of the sum of the calls for service. So meaning there are plenty calls where we get there quicker based on the geography, based on where the officer was responding from. So that also means that there's some of these high priority calls and lower priority calls that actually takes much longer than the 14 minutes and 28 seconds on the high priority calls, or the 34 minutes on the low priority calls. This is an average of the sum of all calls.
Can you tell me just a little bit that board, how that's helpful? What's that showing us?
So this is Situational Dashboard. This tells us real time how many calls are holding, and right now, or the most recent call was a threats in progress. That, as you can see, kind of middle on the left-hand side, that was the most recent call that an officer is responding to, or officers responding to. So to the left, currently we have 10 911 calls that are pending, meaning there are 10 calls and we don't have the available resources to assign an officer to that call and get them to that response. This is how the dispatch center manages these calls. That's why the prioritization is critically important to figure out the crimes in progress, the violent calls for service, and do whatever is possible with the available resources, with the availability of the police officers to get them to respond as quickly as possible.
I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but what accounts do you think for the dramatic increase in response time starting in 2020?
Well, the first part of the year, so we break these down by month, as a matter of fact, so we can see which months we're doing better, which months we're having more challenges, right? You want to have a robust data set to try to identify how best to staff. We do a dynamic staffing, so it's based on calls for service, reported offenses, and getting the maximum amount of police officers to provide the maximum amount of coverage. So the easier way to say this is we don't staff Monday through Sunday exactly the same. Obviously, on an evening shift, a Friday night and a Saturday night is much busier than a Tuesday night. And so the staffing reflects that with more officers on the shifts and days of the week when you have more calls. So that's why the data is critically important. 2020 was a very interesting year. Actually, our response times for the first 3-4 months were quite good. We were able to get to these calls for service quickly because nobody else was working. Everybody was staying from home. The roads were clear. So our response times during the pandemic were very quick. Obviously, we're well aware of what occurred in late May, and the sum of the average then in the second half of 2020 really had some delayed response times to create the number that you see there. But the first quarter of the year, response times were actually quite low, quite quick, as far as getting to those high priority calls.
Could you just spell out, though, what accounted for the dramatic increase the second half of the year?
The second half of the year, we were dealing with many more challenges with regards to some of the violent protests that we saw. There's a lot of staffing that's required to manage those types of events. Although the first 5 days were the most difficult, we had significant protests all the way through the summer into the fall, and it takes a lot of resources to manage those types of events, and those resources come from somewhere, and often that takes officers, patrol officers, out of their particular districts, and it increases the response to emergency calls for service.
And it's just, the response times have just been going up since then.
Continue to go up, and really primarily driven by staffing. When you have, we average 74 retirements a year, and in 2021 we were about double that. So
74 is sort of a historical number,
74 is a historical number.
and last year you had twice that.
Yeah,
roughly.
I believe it was about 148. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that was attrition was like 148.
Yes.
It was just retirements or just
Retirements, separations.
yeah. Attrition was like about 148, and you're on that pace again this year.
Well, I just had this number. I think we're already at about 78-ish this year already. I think we were about 78 midway through this month. So, and then since then, as I indicated, 4 retirements last week, 2 retirements tomorrow. I got plenty of retirements that I'm going to stop by and say goodbye to some really talented officers and investigators.
And I'll get this number from you later, but do you know off the top of your head, last year were you net negative or net positive for the force?
We had to have been net negative. We didn't get more than 148 officers
Right.
In the doors last year.
And it looks like the same thing this year. You'll be net negative.
We will see. We still have 2 academy classes scheduled. We have an August academy class and a December class. So we're hiring. If there's anybody that has a big heart, that cares about their community, that wants to make a difference, then please join us and help us. As I indicated, it's one of the most difficult jobs that there are. It's very complex, but it is very needed. It's very important, and we're looking for good people to help us address the increase in crime that is plaguing our community currently.
And what do you say, because I know you're asked this in the community or by just people in general, what do you say to people when they tell you they're concerned about these response times, when they say, hey, we called the cops and it took them forever to get here? What do you tell them?
That's important to let them know the reality of the situation. And, every neighborhood in Denver deserves a timely response when an individual is facing an emergency. And it's our goal, it's our objective to meet those needs. If you don't have enough police officers to handle those calls for service, then unfortunately there is a delay in being able to respond. We'll continue to work to meet those needs and to get there as quickly as possible. But I hear this in nearly every neighborhood that I'm able to engage with community members. What I hear loud and clear is not the defund police. I don't hear the abolish police. I hear people saying that they want the same or more police in their neighborhood to keep them safe. We have to do our part. We need better policing. We need to train our officers so we can get the better outcomes and help keep our community safe. But right now, the work far outpaces the workforce.
And I'm almost done. How would you just describe your feelings about these response times in general? Are you frustrated? How would you describe your feelings when you look at these numbers? What goes through your head?
Well, I think my feelings are that I'm concerned, and I think that's what I hear from our community members. They're concerned. When they are experiencing an emergency, they want a uniformed police officer to get there as quickly as possible. So we share the same concern, and we will work to try to increase the workforce and meet the growing demands of a growing city at the same time that we're dealing with the staffing challenges that we currently have.
And then I'm sure it's a small part of it, but I did a story maybe a year ago about the fact that part of your labor shortage was with car mechanics. So you had a big backup at the shop, like a lot of cars out of service. Is that still an issue?
We're making a lot of progress there, which is great. So, and when we talk about these response times being a challenge, Denver 911 has some staffing challenges, so they're working hard. So they're looking for good people, right? If you have a big heart, you care about your community, and maybe you don't want to be a police officer, consider being a 911 call taker, a 911 dispatcher, so that we can answer those phones quicker and also help. It's part of a response team.
Right. I'm done. Anna?
Are you doing signing bonuses?
Currently, we're not. I know that there's many departments across the country that are doing signing bonuses, but that is not being offered here in Denver.
Is it hard to compete with other departments for the people?
Well, we are competing against a shrinking workforce, right? I mean, let's hit the pause button for a second. And, there's certainly much easier ways to make a living than doing this. And, we used to have about 5,000 people a year apply to do this job. Now it's in the hundreds. So there is competition for getting the most talented individuals to do this work, and we'll continue to seek the most talented individuals because that's what we want. We want to have the best trained, best equipped officers to handle this very difficult, complex job.
Who would I get? I do want to include. Where could I get stats on calls for service for these same years that you gave me for average response times?
We would be able to. We'll
That'd be
get
great.
total class 1 calls for service.
Yeah.
18, 19, 20, 21.
That'd be
I know that 2021 we had a 4.2% increase over our 3-year baseline. So,
Yes, got it. Yeah.
Make sure, I
Yeah.
don't want you to think that that's a year-over-year comparison. We really focus on the baseline just because of the fluctuations, right? Some places will do a month-to-month comparison, and it's unfair to do, to compare June to May, for
Yeah.
example, right?
Yeah.
May is still kind of the spring, June starts to get summer,
Yeah.
and so there's an increase. Kids are out of school.
Right.
In 1 month, kids are not out of the school.
So 4%, like roughly. I'll get the stats, but how many more calls? Absolute number of calls do you think that was?
I don't remember.
Is it 10,000?
Oh yeah, I think it's closer to the 20,000 range. I don't remember
No, I know. We'll get that.
exactly what that was.
And that I'd love to get that other stat, where maybe recruiting could get that to me. Like 10 years ago, how many people applied? You said 5.
When I applied for this job, it was 4,000 or 5,000 people taking the test in Kurgan Hall, and that was the norm. We've that's dwindled down, and
To a few hundred.
several hundred. I won't say not a few hundred, but it's in the hundreds, not in the thousands the way that it used to be.
That's incredible.
Maybe low thousand. We're
That's incredible. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Anything else you want to say?
I hope that at some point we can actually do this conversation a little bit more justice, right? We also can't ignore the political pressures that have been placed on law enforcement. You had elected leaders both at the State House and in City Council saying defund, abolish, decenter the police. Nobody was saying that about the fire department, right? Law enforcement across the state is experiencing challenges as far as recruitment and retention. I don't think that that's the same as our brothers and sisters in the fire service. So oftentimes I hear that the labor market is short in many jobs, and that's true. But policing is a career, just as firefighting. Firefighting is a career. We're not talking about jobs, we're talking about careers, typically careers that last 25, 30, or we just celebrated folks that did 40 years of service to their community. You have one profession that across the state is struggling to find qualified recruits, and you have another profession that's not seeing the same types of challenges. And I think that some of the political rhetoric still exists, and I think that that is impacting attracting good quality candidates. So that's a big part of it, and this is the time that we need leadership from the highest elected officials in the state to step up and say, join this noble profession to be the change that they want to see, to help us keep our communities safe. And I'm hopeful that in the future, some of these exact same people that said decenter, defund, and abolish recognize the importance of high quality policing to help keep a community safe.